I have with me today Yael Eckstein, the global president of the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews, an organization that works with Christians to help them support the State of Israel and give humanitarian aid throughout the Jewish state and the world. And I'm Maayan Hoffman, Executive Editor of ILTV. And welcome back to the ILTV News Podcast. And welcome to you.
Thank you so much, Maayan. I'm so happy to be here with you.
So Yael, since October 7th, the fellowship has been a lifeline, literally a lifeline for so many Israelis. Tell me a little bit about the specific programs that you've been running or expanding since October 7th and the impact that you're seeing firsthand.
Well, before October 7th, the fellowship was operating on the ground in Israel and across the former Soviet Union to help provide basic needs to the Jewish community for over 40 years. So when October 7th struck, we were ready to respond immediately. In the first week following October 7th, we distributed over $5 million of aid. So we were able to distribute thousands of bulletproof vests and helmets. We were able to be there to provide food and clothing and basics to the people who were released from their miklatim, from their shelters after 30 hours, to the families of loved ones who died and were kidnapped, to the heroic first responders. We were prepared to respond immediately. And in the year and a half since then, the needs have changed on the ground. But the ongoing support from the global Christian community has only gotten stronger, and our programs have only been able to make even more of an impact. So in the first year following October 7th, we distributed over 2.5 million meals from our soup kitchens alone. From Kiryat Shmona, actually, our Kiryat Shmona soup kitchen was hit by a direct rocket from Hezbollah. Within 24 hours, we were providing food, though. We found a different location, and we're providing food to the elderly in that evacuated town who decided to stay. Down to Sderot and Eilat, we've been there for the hospitals, the mifunim, the evacuated citizens, the families of the hostages, the Noba survivors, and anyone in need.
And in the last 6 months, have the needs changed? Is it still more aid in soup kitchens, or are you looking at other needs at this point?
Well, what we see is during times of relative quiet, which during the ceasefire it's been right now, it's our opportunity to equip the home front for the next round. Okay. In Israel, you're always living from war to war. And we know once war begins, once the active missile fire begins, you're limited in what you're able to do. So right now we're focusing on equipping the local cities and emergency first responders and different organizations and hospitals with the equipment that they need. So when, God forbid, the next onslaught might come, hopefully it won't, but that we'll be ready to deal with it and save lives.
Incredible. Now, the fellowship, as you mentioned, is built on this vision of bringing Christians and Jewish communities together, of the Christians supporting Israel. How do you see Christian support for Israel evolving in this new chapter? I mean, especially since the evangelicals right now are actually holding a very significant, portfolio in the Trump administration.
Well, it's interesting. From the time my father, Rabbi Yael Eckstein of blessed memory, started the organization in 1983.
Wow, it's wild.
It is. Christian support for Israel has changed so much. Yeah. But it's been constant. It's been steady. It's been reliable. And that's what I think we've really been able to see since October 7th, especially. The Jewish community has invested over the years in so many communities. We've stood with so many others in their plight for freedom and fairness and equality. And we were sure that if a day ever came where the Jewish community was fighting anti-Semitism, then they would stand with us as well. And we already saw on October 8th these allies, people we thought were allies, turning their backs against us. And so since October 7th, what I've seen is that this friendship has been tested and it has survived those tests. Yeah. It's no longer cool to stand with Israel. It's no longer even politically correct necessarily to stand with Israel, and yet they don't care what the winds of time bring in politics and policy and social norms. The Christian community continues to stand with Israel, you might say, stronger now than ever before, as we need this friendship more now than ever before.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm assuming it's really largely based on their biblical beliefs that they need to stand with Israel, Genesis 12. And is that really the foundation of this all?
Yeah, so I think there are so many reasons. If you ask 5 Christians why they stand with Israel, you'll get 5 different answers. But it all goes back to that. Israel isn't just another country. Israel is a spiritual country. Israel is the only land in the world that God himself named, who said what people he wants to live there. We're the only people, the Jewish people, that we were in exile for thousands of years, and suddenly we were reunited with our biblical homeland, that this biblical tongue became our national language. I mean, it's something that we're used to, but I definitely never want to think that this is a given. And definitely the Christian community, when they read the Torah, the Bible, and they see Isaiah and Jeremiah, and they see, okay, this is God's plan. This is God's will, and we want to be part of it. So there are many people who will say, especially now, we learned from the past, Christians who will say, I want to be part of the Christians who are known for blessing and standing with Israel even during the hard times. I want to be part of the Christians who have learned from history, like the Corrie ten Booms, those like that righteous Gentile during the Holocaust who hid Jews while risking her own life. Right. I think there's the historical context. I think there's the spiritual context. And I think there's also the reality that they see that America has no better friend than Israel. Europe has no better friend than Israel. We stand for the same values. We stand for freedom, sanctity of life, and we face the same threats.
Yeah, and certainly they always say it starts here and it will only expand if we don't hold down the home frontier against the sources of evil, without question. And one of the things, you were talking about with Christian support for Israel, it's interesting that in this war, I feel like I've seen more and more that Christians have opened their pocketbooks. They always have through the fellowship. Yeah. When they give the micro gifts and their tithes, and there's been others that have given larger, but it's been really amazing, I think, watching the last 18 months, some of these more prominent Christian influencers coming here and, donating full ambulances or full, revitalizing full communities. I mean, it's been really striking. Do you feel that as well?
Wow, I feel it in such an inspiring way that everyone just wants to do what they can. So, like you mentioned earlier, there are some whose cause is politics and they stand politically with Israel. There are some who come on tourism to Israel, and they come on pilgrimages, and that really supports the Israeli economy and helps the people of Israel in so many ways. What I see with the humanitarian aid is that this is something that everyone is able to do. Some of the most precious donations that we've gotten, we've raised over $3.1 billion.
Wow.
The fellowship. $3.1 billion
in 18 months.
In 40 years.
Oh, okay.
Last year,
I was like, what?
We're not a government.
Okay. I was like, wow.
Last year, we raised over $300 million from from over 800,000 donors, which is incredible. And what I see is that a lot of people give $25, and that food box for them is the most precious thing that they can do. I spoke to a woman the other day. She was donating $25 a day. Every single day she would call to make a $25 donation. I asked her, why don't you just donate $150 a week or whatever you can? And she said, well, my husband died, and every night when I sit down for dinner, I donate the money that I would have spent on cooking him food for that day, and I know that's how he would want his memory to be honored. So sometimes it's the huge donation of ambulances, and even when I talk about it, that we need now bulletproof ambulances, who would have thought that we have our first responders being targeted, that we need to focus on protecting them. But sometimes it's those huge programs of making a ICU unit bulletproof and shrapnel proof and mimugan, protected from missiles. But sometimes it's also that one food box, $25, that was donated with such love and devotion that moves me.
Yeah, wow, that's so nice. Now, Mike Huckabee, he's here in the country. He just arrived recently. He's a longtime friend of Israel. He's also a very devout Christian. He's our first evangelical Christian ambassador to Israel. And he is going to be pretty significant, I would say, today. How significant do you think that is, having a Christian in that position? And what opportunities do you see for Huckabee being able to sort of play a role in deepening the Christian-Israel ties here in the country?
Well, I've known Ambassador Huckabee for years. We've been good friends. When I thought he was out of politics already,
no one ever leaves politics.
I've learned my lesson. But he's come to Israel many times with the fellowship. And so the way I know Ambassador Huckabee is not actually for his policy or his politics, but for his heart, for the person who is. When you travel around a country for 12 hours, nonstop, days on end, you get to know the person really good. And what I see in Ambassador Huckabee is that He's always kind to the driver, that when we have a waitress that comes to take the order, he asks about their life, that he's always with a smile, that it's meaningful for him to go and deliver a food box with the fellowship, that all he wants to do is sit with the elderly, hear their story, that he reaches out and takes their hand and really, really cares that when the camera's on or when the camera's off, he's there to just be a good person. So I think it's very symbolic that there's an evangelical Christian as the ambassador to Israel. I think it's the second non-Jewish U.S. ambassador ever to Israel.
Oh, really?
I
knew that.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so it's a big message. And I don't know what Ambassador Huckabee's political plans are or what he'll do regarding policy, but I know that he has a heart for Israel. He understands Israel deeply. And to have someone who understands not just the policy and politics of Israel, but the spiritual message and need and understanding of this very unique country, I think is something not only that will serve good for Israel-America relations, but what I've seen is many of my Christian friends who are in leadership positions are the ones who are flying to Arab countries and trying to create peace from that spiritual understanding. Christians and Muslims, Christians and Jews, Jews and Muslims, not just from a policy perspective, but from a religious, spiritual perspective. I don't think it's by chance that the Abraham Accords came out of what many people say is being led by Christian voters and interests in America. So I hope that these next few years will be good for Israel, will be good for America, for Israel-America relations, and I really believe that they'll be good for the entire Middle East, who wants peace, prays for peace, and is willing to take hard steps for peace.
Wow, from your mouth to God's ears. You know, there are people, though, that say that it is a little bit controversial to work so close with Christians, and maybe even that we're becoming too reliant on Christian support as the political tides shifts. Because, you know, we saw that when no longer Trump was in office during the hiatus with Biden, there were some challenges because Israel has sort of thrown all its eggs into this evangelical basket. Is there any risk from your perspective of getting too close, either religiously or politically, with this group abroad? You know, is there a risk also on the evangelical side with the younger evangelicals? I understand their support for Israel is dwindling, that they might turn the other way.
There's always a risk in everything because we can't tell the future. On October 6th, we would have been having a very different conversation about risks than on October 7th. And so we can only go based on what we know right now. And again, I'm not someone who is deeply involved in politics, or I don't even follow it so closely. But what I see on the ground, I meet a lot of people, a lot of different people, diverse people. And what I see on the ground is that you have extremes on both sides that we should be wary of, we should be careful for, we should be scared and cautious with. On the right and the left, you have, of course, the circle that meets in the middle and where it meets is that both the extreme right and the extreme left hate Jews, that both the extreme right and the extreme left are spreading blood libels about the Jews, that they might disagree on everything, where they come together, and this is something that we've seen before throughout history so many times. They come together at that place of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and who's the enemy here? Anyone who's Jewish, anyone who stands with Israel, anyone who they would call a Zionist. But I think there's really a silenced majority, and we see that all over. Most of the people understand Israel's plight. Most of the people understand Israel's fighting for freedom. Most of the people understand there's one side that sanctifies life, which is Israel, and there's one side that cherishes death, that worships death, and that's Islamic extremists, and that it's a shared threat to all of us. I'm working very closely with the Christian community in Syria, who's been targeted, persecuted, and killed. You see the Christian communities in Iraq. You see how the Coptic Christian community in Lebanon, how that has decreased so significantly. You see across the Middle East, the Christian community being targeted the same way the Jewish community is. And so I don't know what the future will bring, but I know if right now we as Israelis, as Jews, have this historic friendship, this historic opportunity to partner strategically, spiritually, practically with over 700 million evangelicals around the world, a majority of them who will confidently say, I stand with Israel.
Incredible.
We have to invest in that relationship so that we don't create a self-fulfilling prophecy. The second we say we should back off from standing with these people who want to stand with us because we might not be able to rely on them in the future, that's creating a reality
where we won't be able to.
Where we won't have friends and we'll be able to say, see, I told you, but it's only because we didn't invest in this very fragile but very important relationship.
Wow. So, since the start of the war, we've seen a rise in anti-Semitism, as you mentioned. I mean, it's across the board. It was interesting last week, with Yom HaShoah, of course, Holocaust Remembrance Day. We had the big report that comes out every year that looks at it and at the spikes, identified Australia and then Italy as the top two countries, but it has been in every country. How important it is for Jews and Christians, specifically on this issue, to stand together? I mean, you started to allude to that, I think, with regards to the, the work that's happening with being with our friends. And I know the fellowship has also been somewhat involved in this fight in anti-Semitism. So talk about both the importance and also what role specifically the fellowship, which is generally seen as a humanitarian organization, can play.
I think we do a really bad job at getting out our story. When I was in America just a few weeks ago, I was in Texas, and everywhere I went, I was stopped by people who said, I love Israel, I pray for Israel, I stand with Israel, to the point that I even went to like a secondhand store just to get a little bit away and have some quiet. And I was checking out, the woman said to me, do people tell you that you look like? I was like, who? Because no one tells me I look like anyone. She said, no, that woman in Jerusalem who helps feed the hungry on behalf of people like me. I'm like, oh, yeah, that's me.
Oh, that's so funny.
It is funny, but it was so eye-opening for me to see, firstly, they love Israel. We have friends. We're not alone. We read the statistics. We see about the rise in anti-Semitism. That's not the full story. And I think the greatest way to fight that terrifying trend that's very real and should scare us all is by actually investing in our friends. You can curse the darkness or you can bless the light. You can go and try to change the minds of those people rallying on Berkeley campus and try to go and speak rationally and tell our story to the BDS, people that are on Columbia College not letting Jews walk by. You're not going to get very far. And so what I think is we have to tell our story. We have to be able to share what's going on a day-to-day basis more with the people who already stand with us so that we don't lose them. I see so many young Christians coming to me and saying, Yael, I saw this on the news. Could you explain to me the context? I saw that Israel bombed a hospital. Could you explain to me why Israel would bomb a hospital?
Wow, it's good they're asking you the questions.
Yeah.
Wow.
But we need to tell our story. And I think our story is a beautiful one. I went down to Sderot not long after October 7th, and I was bringing food aid to an elderly Holocaust survivor there who, she said, I would rather die from a missile in my house than evacuate and live as an evacuee. And so she was living in Sderot where there were no social services because the entire town was evacuated and there was no garbage pickup, there were no neighbors, there's no grocery stores open, there's no doctors there. And so we go in and we have volunteers who would go and visit them and bring them their food. And I sat with her and I said, this food box is from Christians in America who just wanted you to know that you're not alone. And she started crying and she said, yeah, I'm a Holocaust survivor. And people keep saying, oh, the times are so similar to the early 1930s in Germany. She said, I watched the Hamas terrorists on my lawn shoot my neighbor. And yet the times are not the same. Because there is a voice that's standing with Israel. There's a voice of people who care. And she looked at me and she said, never stop telling our story to them. And for me, that's what gives me so much hope and faith and drive and motivation. We have such an honor to tell this story of Israel. We're no longer strangers in a strange land. We're a country that sanctifies life, that creates medical innovation, that's saving lives around the world, that provides bomb shelters for our people instead of using them as human shields, that has an army that's as diverse as the Jewish people, that if we were in America, for example, 50% of the Israeli population wouldn't qualify as being called white. And so we have the most diverse, beautiful people, from Muslims to Druze to Christians to Bedouins to Haredi to secular. We have a story that represents, I believe, the epitome of holiness, of sanctification of life. And the more we tell that story, I think, the more we'll be able to sustain our friends, acquire more friends, and never again stand alone.
So you meet with a lot of people. Really, really important people. I mean, you were mentioning, this woman in a thrift store, but the reason that people recognize you is because you actually have the ability to really meet with the people at the highest echelons, from the White House in the UK. I'll tell you this, I met last week with Rachel and John Goldberg-Pollen, and I asked them what they learned over the course last months of the work that they did first to try to rescue Hirsch, and of course, since then the other hostages, since he was brutally murdered. And John said something very interesting. He said that he learned that there is actually much more bureaucracy and much more. He was kind of turned off by the levels in the government, because he said things that seemed obvious to him and natural to him. He has a lot of hope in humanity. He said that very positively, but he said, they always said, well, we have other issues or there are other factors at stake. And he said, I don't understand these hostages. These are people. And I ask you, you have this beautiful story. You just said told incredible stories. But when you go and meet with the leadership, when you go up to these top levels, do you feel like John, or do you feel like there is hope for the leadership? And I'm going to caveat with one more thing. You mentioned how, there's the silent majority. Well, I think of South Africa as a great example of that. And this is why I asked this question. Also, the government has taken us to the courts, right? It's getting changed a little now, but they have come out so strongly against the Jewish people and against Israel. Yet the majority of the South African community, the citizens, are Christians and are supportive, from what I understand, of Israel by all polls. So what is your take? Do you have hope, or are you also saying, God, not in every position, but we need a change of leadership in order to really fulfill this vision that you just described?
It's an incredible question. And I actually don't call them the silent majority. I call most of those people the silenced majority, because they are trying so hard to get their voice heard. And many of them are doing a great job, which is how we know about them, which is how we see the people of South Africa stand with us. Right. We see you, we hear you, we feel you, thank you. But they're being silenced. I think it's a strategic, intentional plan from the powers that be that are quieting those voices even when they speak so loud. You can look even at the Eurovision, of course, that all the judges almost voted against the Israeli participant at Eurovision last year, and yet she received almost all of the votes of the people who called in. It's the silenced majority. And the truth is, I'm really privileged in the sense of I have one focus: implementing as many humanitarian programs as possible to help as many people as possible. And my father, Zichrono Livracha, Rabbi Yael Eckstein, who started the fellowship, who ran it for 34 years until he died. I've been running it for 6 years. He had no programs with the Israeli government. He said, we don't want to be part of that bureaucracy. Our mark is that we're able to affect change immediately. Our mark is that when we see a need, we don't have to wait for anyone. We don't have roundtable discussions. We are on the ground acting the second we see it. And so when I took over the fellowship after my father died, we had first Corona, and then we had the Ukraine war, and then we had October 7th. And I always kept his voice in my mind of, we don't have bureaucracy. We act. We were on the ground on October 7th in Sderot when there were still terrorists roaming, helping whatever people were able to help, working with the municipality in order to say, how can we be here to strengthen you and provide whatever you're not able to. And that is our policy, and that is how we act. But what I also saw is that I've worked with quite a few governments in Israel, with many different parties leading specifically the Ministry of Welfare, Ministry of Aliyah, or the Ministry of Security, all the different areas that we work with. And what I see is that every single one of them, and without exceptions, the people who are leading those ministries want to do good. They have the intention and ratzon and desire to do good for the people. I haven't seen anyone who doesn't really have the intention to make things better. Okay. But there's bureaucracy. And so what I learned is that the government is actually very good at allocating funds. They're not as good as building programs. And so I take that upon myself. Instead of cursing the darkness, I bless the light. I could sit and complain a lot about the government. You look at the state of welfare and poverty and the percentages of people who live below the poverty line in Israel, and there's a lot to complain about. But what I see is that when there's an opportunity for change, from my experience in my field, the government has jumped on it. And so we've been able to create many programs. Okay, government, what are the criteria? Who are the people that you want to help? Who are the people that are in need that you're able? And the fellowship actually builds programs according to the criteria that they need. We hand it to them. We do matching programs. And in the past 3 years, we've opened up over 350 million shekel from the government for humanitarian programs.
Wow.
So we started the first national food program together with Eshel, which has only grown over the years. When there were, during Corona, when there were elderly in their home who needed food because they don't store up as much as families extra food and there were closures, we had a program with the government that we went on the government's behalf and brought them food to their homes immediately during those closures. During the war, when there were evacuated people, some of them went to hotels and then the government was able to help them. But for all the others who were spread out everywhere and putting so much difficulty on the social service network, on the municipal social workers and the budgets there, we created a program that we're able to find them, provide them what they need wherever they were without it creating additional hardships for the municipal social workers who are anyways overwhelmed. And so the government, from my experience, is there to help. They're there to allocate funds. They're not so good at building programs. And so it's something we've taken on and seen incredible achievements with.
And it's incredible that you've managed to achieve that, because I think that many organizations don't necessarily have the ability to sort of be the driver and then just say, okay, what do you need? We'll build it and we'll also implement it. You just give us the funds or match the funds. So, and you are the largest nonprofit humanitarian organization allocating in Israel. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's incredible. And really that's since the last 6 years, since you've taken over.
We've grown significantly, thank God.
Thank God. Always the next generation. Your father is probably looking down and saying, amazing, that's always the goal of the parents, is to make the kids more successful than the parent. And it's funny because the next question, I always write down some questions in advance. It says, you carry forward the legacy of your father, Rabbi Yael Eckstein, who founded the fellowship. And I'm wondering, this is my question, is how do you personally feel his vision has been tested and affirmed during this very painful period? And I know that you think it has. So how do you think?
I used to say to my father before he died, not long before he died, I said, Abba, you were a prophet. Because it was right when the U.S. Embassy moved to Jerusalem, because mostly the Christian community in America telling the Trump administration to do that and recognizing the Golan Heights. And what I heard from all the people in that administration and the Christians who supported the decision was, we don't want to decide what's best for Israel. But if the Israeli government has been saying for 40 years they want the embassy in Jerusalem, we're going to push to make that happen. We want to do what the Israeli government wants. Now, we don't have our own agenda. Our agenda is to do what the Israeli government asks us to do. And I think that was the time that Christian support for Israel became kind of mainstream.
Right, because I remember, I'm not as old as your father, but I do remember working with him more than 20 years ago when, and writing about him. And it was very controversial at the time. And, there were people that really condemned his work with the Christians. Even rabbis. And I remember just over the decades, like one rabbi would say it's okay, and then another rabbi would say it's okay. And I at the time when I was doing different reporting, you'd write like a small story about a rabbi, whatever, said this, and all of a sudden it was like starting. And you're right, like right around the time that Trump came into office, it was already accepted. Even Bibi, right, Netanyahu in 1996, I want to say it was when he stood at the Kufi conference and said the line about Christians being our best friends, but it took a decade more to get to the Ron Dermer comments of, we really care a lot about the Christians in the United States. We won't get into the other controversial things he said, but he really, at that point, 10 years later, understood it. But it took a long time.
So I guess there's the leadership and then there's the masses, because even Begin deeply understood the importance of the Christian community and Christian Zionism. There were 10 evangelical Christians at the First Zionist Council.
Really?
Yeah. And so it goes back to even before the State of Israel was established, that you had Christians who were envisioning this with Herzl, with David Ben-Gurion. And so it's really the masses now of, first of all, the masses of Christians. Then they were the charig. They were the out-of-the-ordinary minority of Christians who are standing for this cause. Now it's the majority. And so I remember my father looked at me and said, Yael, when I started this organization 40 years ago, when I was ostracized from the Jewish community, when I couldn't go up to the Torah to read from the Torah at your sister's bat mitzvah because I worked with Christians, when people stopped being friends with me and I wasn't allowed to be counted in a minyan and they wouldn't let me learn Torah, he said, I wasn't a prophet. I was a man with a mission. I believed in it. And sometimes when you believe in something, you don't know where it's going to take you, but you have to keep doing it with everything you have because you've been called for that. And I've thought about that so many times, Maayan, when the world changed overnight and it was this voice of my father saying, sometimes you don't know exactly where it's going to go, but you know you have to go out and do it. When we were evacuating Jews from Ukraine, when the Ukraine-Russia war broke out and all the airports were closed and we were evacuating them to Moldova, and Moldova airport was closed, and we got them to open it up for humanitarian flights, that we brought in aid and brought Jews out to Israel. And there's been one time after another that the voice of my father is with me saying, when you have the ability to help, you help. When you have the ability to save lives, you save lives. When you have the ability to bring light and bridge people and play a positive part in this historic story that we're living, you do it, even if you don't know exactly where it will take you.
Must be amazing to wake up and be you every day. So now we're getting ready, of course, for Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut. They're coming up in the next couple of days. What's your message, first of all, to the Christians, then to the Jews, and then to the broader international community about what Israel needs most right now from its friends?
I think it's the same message to everyone, Maayan.
Okay.
I look at what's happening in Israel, let's start with, and I see all the different protests and all the different very, very extreme, passionate opinions on every issue you could imagine. And I'm not involved in any of them. And I sit back, and what I was just saying to my son yesterday when we were talking about this was, I said, Liam, look how much every single one of them cares about Israel. Look how much every single one of the people at all the protests, right wing, left wing, look how much they love Israel, that they refuse to give up on this land. They are willing to do anything to make it better for you, for the future, for the next generation. That you could look at it as so different, or you could look at it as so much the same. And what I see, Maayan, is that the world is being forced to choose. And there aren't so many colors. It's pretty black and white. And you're either with a future of freedom and prosperity and dignity for all of humankind, or you're against that. I think the cards are falling. That is becoming more and more and more clear. Everyone can and should have their own opinions of policy and how it looks and who's the right prime minister and what party should be in power and what place does religion and state play in. These are issues that are being dealt with on a global scale as this next stage of democracy comes to be. But I still think that it comes down to something really simple. Are we going to stand together as people who value life, who sanctify life, who want a future of freedom for our children? Or are we going to make all different excuses of why now it's suddenly okay to stand with the forces of darkness? So I think the Jewish community has been forced to wake up to that overseas, that with all the different issues that are important locally, that they've been taking on as the priority, suddenly anti-Semitism comes into play, and you see, standing together, there's nothing more important. And you see the Christian community who recognizes the Christians being persecuted in the Middle East, Christians being targeted and persecuted in places like America and Europe, and they realize we're in this together. Of course, from a spiritual perspective, of course, the terrorists themselves use biblical terms when they say first we're going for the Saturday people and then the Sunday people.
They call out Allahu Akbar, right? They're like praising God as they do
We're
that.
all infidels.
Yes.
But I think the main message that I see as all of us needing to internalize is, if we stand together, we can have our differences. There are many different colors in a rainbow, but they all come together to form something so beautiful. But we need to stand together.
Beautiful. Well, Yael Eckstein, the Global President of the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Maayan.